welcome to this month's edition of Slugger TV. In this episode, we're going to be examining the legacy of the former SDLP leader, John Hume. And to start off the programme, we're going to go to someone who had experience of John Hume, the former Mayor of Derry, Councillor John Boyle. John, you're joining us from Derry. Just what are your thoughts and what's the mood in the city this morning?
Well, obviously, we're all deeply saddened by the loss of John. Not entirely unexpected, of course. He was ill for some considerable time. But the mood in the city yesterday and of course today, and I expect it'll continue for some time, David, actually, it's very, very sombre. People are clearly reflecting on all of what John achieved and sought to change. And obviously, in the conversations that I've had with people, the reflections are that it was a powerful life, well lived.
And what do you think, I mean, in terms of his impact on the SDLP, obviously you've been in the SDLP for years, what was his impact on the party? You know, the fact he had the party leader and a Derry man there as well.
Well, it's not uncommon, actually, that the party leader comes from this part of the country, and we've had a couple since John as well, you know. But John obviously played a very pivotal role in the foundation and formation of the SDLP. And we're particularly proud of that aspect of his life. But there was much more to John Hume than simply the SDLP. John's politics were very much founded in the city that he grew up in, the conditions that he saw around him, the education that he had at a particular time in his life. And he applied all of that then. He applied that to his politics, and I suppose in a sense John was the inspiration for so many people in the city, not least of all myself. I've actually known John since I was a child. I went to the same school as his children and my brothers and sisters, and so we would be close as family friends as much as we would be close in a professional capacity, and so it's from that very deep personal perspective that I reflect on John and reflect on everything that he did for people in this city in particular, but obviously right across the country.
And obviously people have been reflecting on the work that he did in bringing new industry and jobs to Derry. You know, most of the big industries that we associate with Derry today were actually brought in by John Hume when he was the MP and MEP, of course. You know, in terms of his role in developing Derry, you know, how felt is that to this day?
Well, I think the important thing to recognise is that the Derry that we have today is a very different Derry to the place that John was born in. In reality, the levels of poverty that we had in this city in the 1930s, where we're talking probably Glasgow tenement type stuff, in fact, in some cases worse than that. And that's where John came from, and so this is a very, very different place to the place that he was born in, and then obviously the opportunities that came through the 11 plus. I think John always reflected on that as something that gave him and others of his generation a chance at education, and from there then upward into his career initially as a school teacher and then into politics. So John clearly saw many injustices, and probably one of the biggest injustices that he would have witnessed was the fact that there were such high levels of unemployment, and so therefore his focus would have been on changing that economic opportunity that so few realised and recognised at that time in the city.
And final question, John. Obviously, Aoife Grease-Moore, a journalist from Derry, was reflecting yesterday about how you know, John looked after Derry, and then in his later years, people in Derry started looking after him. It wouldn't be uncommon for taxi men just to pick him up, or people they'd see him out walking along the foil, they'd just walk with him and just make sure he got home okay. What are your reflections on that, about how kind of it was a bit of a role reversal in the last 15 years, people of Derry coming to look out and help for him?
I think probably people in Derry just thought they owed him something, and even the taxi men might have felt that they owed him something too, you know. And actually, you know, when I'm reflecting on that, I have to say it for all of us here, it's like the loss of a dad. We've lost our father, and John was a father to everyone in this city. Hugely respected, widely respected, and loved. And that's the truth. He was loved, and the people of this city loved John Hume. And that's why people would have stopped in the street, picked him up, and ran him home. And that's, John was a great character. That's the thing. I think an awful lot of people have a tendency to sort of reflect on John and look at his politics. But the great thing about John was he was actually just an ordinary human being like everybody else, living in extraordinary times and trying to make some kind of a difference and a change. And in truth, the philosophy of the SDLP today is the same philosophy that it was when John and others founded the party. My core principles are the very same as John Hume's, and that's not an accident because he's the man who inspired people like me.
Okay. Former Mayor of Derry, John Boyle, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, and we're going to continue our discussion on the legacy of John Hume and to go through this man's long career. We have the Irish News security correspondent, Allison Morris, and we have Stephen Grimason, former BBC political correspondent. Stephen, I want to go to you first. You covered Hume when he was in his heyday, when he was the leader of nationalism. What was your impressions of him, just looking at him as a journalist, when he was kind of at the peak of his political powers?
He was kind of a force of nature, like sort of a one-man tornado, and that tornadoes cause destruction sometimes, and he just didn't seem to care what anybody else thought he was doing, whether it was in his own party, whether it was Republicans, whether it was Unionists. He was doing his thing, and he was just utterly and completely committed to this vision he had for peace. And one of the things I heard yesterday for the first time was that he'd written a letter to the Irish Times in 1964 setting out a three-stranded process. And can anybody conceive of a situation where we will have any movement in this country which isn't based on a three-stranded process? So even at that point, he was thinking this out. And he just, there were many different sides of him. He could be incredibly charming, great man to be out with for a drink. And Ken Reid and I spent more time with him with a few scoops in our hand than we really should have, because he had hollow legs, and Seamus Malin had the same affliction. But by the same token, if you said something he didn't like, boy, oh boy, he was on the case, and there would be screaming rows and wars. And he would phone me, and he'd phone you sometimes in the middle of the night to give out to you about something that you'd said, and never you ring me again, and that's us finished. And then 20 minutes later, he's on the phone again saying, "Now, what do you think of this?"
Okay. And Alison, obviously, growing up, when you were growing up in West Belfast, obviously we reflected with John there, a lot of Hume's story was in Derry, but also West Belfast as well. You take a look at where he first engaged with Sinn Féin and Father Alec Reid and all, and that's played into it as well. So when you were growing up in West Belfast, what did you make of John Hume?
Look, we would have known in the latter part that the Hume and Adams talks were taking place, and that was the greatest chance that we had of peace. And also the Clonard in the heart of West Belfast was playing a major role in facilitating those talks and facilitating bringing those sides together. But I mean, most of that people wouldn't have known because it was happening in the back room. I suppose for me, when I think about what life was like when we were growing up, you have to go right back to prior to that and to the start of the civil rights movement. And we know that John Hume and others who founded that movement, they were inspired by the civil rights movement in America and by those civil rights leaders, and that we lived in a place and a time of great inequality. And the inequality that my parents would have suffered, it doesn't exist for my children. And if you ask why it doesn't exist for my children, and why, as a Catholic woman from West Belfast, that I was able to go on and do things that my parents couldn't do, it's because of those people who started that civil rights movement. And not only that, if you think about John Hume's role in founding the credit union, that gave economic freedom to so many working class families. Like, our first car was bought from the credit union. Our holiday every year to Butlins was paid for by the credit union. The credit union would have bought your school uniform blazer. So to give people that, and as a journalist, I've been to visit other developing countries, and when you go there, the charities say, well, we're trying to set up this scheme where people will pay in, and I'm looking at them going, it's the credit union. You're basically trying to start up the credit union. And And so all of those things made all of our lives immeasurably better. But if you come to the very sort of the real crux of it, the day of that fortnight, I suppose, which stands out in my life of growing up, that horrible fortnight where we had Gibraltar and then we had Milltown and Michaelstone and then the corporal killings at the funeral of Kevin Brady. That was horrendous, and to live in the middle of that at that time, it was probably the darkest time. I remember seeing grown men crying in the street. You know, our lives were falling apart and nobody could see any light out of this darkness. And years later, I remember watching the 14 Days documentary, the Father Alec Reid documentary, and he talks about how he went to that funeral to get a letter of Gerry Adams, and the letter that he was to get off Gerry Adams, he was to bring and give to John Hume, and that was part of the very early days of that engagement. And when we think back now, imagine, you know, that this engagement was taking place by letters being handed from one person to another by a priest. It seems, you know, insane now. And then you remember, like I'm sure you've all seen that, you know, biblical looking picture of Father Reid over one of the bodies of one of the corporals at Wasteground, very close to where I grew up, giving him the last rites and the blood on his face. And he speaks in that documentary about how he went back to Clonard, and when he took the letter out that he had to give to John Hume, it had blood on it. Mm-hmm. And you know, that I remember thinking, if anything ever symbolised the role that was played during that time by those men in trying to bring people away from violence, trying to save us all from that awful reality that we were living in at that time, that's it. You know, this letter that was so important in those early days of engagement, you know, had the blood of a man on it, you know, and I think that sums it up. But for me, when I look back, I just think that had it not been for John Hume, and I know that there were other major figures involved in that as well, who started that civil rights movement, I don't know that if my life and my children's lives would have been played out the way that they have. You know, I think that we all would have been worse off, and that's not just in terms of the nationalist community, that's in terms of the loyalist community who were also living in horrendous housing conditions at that time. That's also in terms of women and unemployment. It's in terms of so many things. And when you think about how that changed our lives, isn't that such a legacy to leave, you know, to be able to look back, if that was, you know, your father or someone you loved, and say, look at what they achieved, not just for a small group of people in the city that he loved, but for everybody that lives on this island, in this part of the island.
Yeah. And Stephen, obviously you got to see Hume and the stature he had around the world as well. He wasn't just a well-known figure here. One of the things that's been telling me, you've had Tony Blair making statements, you had the Democratic nominee Joe Biden making statements, you know, you had Bill Clinton. What was, I mean, when you watch Hume's presence around the world and in places like the European Union, I mean, how did he command that kind of presence?
He had a tremendous clout across the world. And there's a really interesting piece from Nancy Soderberg from the National Security Council, ex-National Security Council Deputy Director, saying that he drove American policy towards Ireland generally for about 40 years. I mean, among the things that he's done that he's never had any real credit for, he played a huge role in moving the Irish peace process from the State Department, which was quite Anglophile in America, into the National Security Council, which then, with Nancy Soderberg and others, could really get moving with it, because there was a tremendous blockage. There was a sense of the dead hand of the British on the peace process, particularly around things like the Gerry Adams visa, which Hume played a huge role in. In Europe, they loved him in Europe, mostly because he used the European example of, well, that stopped the Third World War. We should be using some of that here. So his influence around the world was quite enormous. And that's reflected in all the peace awards that he received. But this didn't happen by just some sort of, you know, his personal charm. He worked at this for years. He was assiduous in the way he worked at things in both the European Union and in America. And the internationalization of the peace process, as it were, was largely down to him. And I think George Mitchell had it right. He was not an architect of the peace process. He was the architect of the peace process.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, I remember, I mean, that the value you put in personal relations. I remember reading about when he was going to meet Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the US House of Representatives. Hume did lots of digging into O'Neill's family tree and found out there were links back to Donegal, and brought some mementos, or I think he either brought O'Neill to Donegal, and O'Neill broke down in tears with the level at which Hume went to kind of find out about that and to deal with that.
The level of detail that he applied to these things, even in basic lunches with staffers in Washington, he'd be inviting them to Derry. On the day, for instance, when the old power sharing executive back in the 70s fell, he told me he'd just done a deal to get 4,000 jobs to come to Northern Ireland because he was Minister for Commerce. And I remember Mark Durkan said he would disappear to America for a month and come back with 1,000 jobs. And he was always being told, here, we can give you money, we can give money to the SDLP. He said, no. The way out of this is through a better economy as well. So he pushed people who came at him saying, I can give you money. He said, no, I don't want your money. I want your jobs.
Okay, that's and Alison. Obviously, that is. I mean, we're Derry in particular is still to this day wrestling with some of the economic inequalities there. How do you think? I mean, obviously, it's hard from a Northern Ireland perspective to have a politician that commands that influence, both in Brussels, Washington, London, Dublin. Like Hume walked up to all these governmental doors and they opened. But how do you think he was able to do that?
I think it's, well, first of all, the sort of brand at that time and how the media portrayed, anyone who's like for Sinn Féin, it would have been quite toxic. So he wasn't toxic. He was a man who endorsed peace. He was quite clear about that. So therefore that made him the sort of more acceptable face of nationalism, if you liked, and he was able to open those doors. But also, let us not, just as we look back and eulogize someone, pretend that he was, this Gandhi, passive, lovely grandfather. You can see in the pictures of Derry of this man standing on his own in front of Rad Place. He was not that person. He was, he was big, he was gruff, he was at times aggressive. He knew what it was that he wanted, and he went in and demanded that received. And if the door was closed, he kicked it open. He wasn't. I think that we're in danger because we remember the very old, the older Hume in his later years, of forgetting that this was a radical young civil rights protester, in the middle of Derry, and that the history that he had learned through his teaching about other struggles and conflicts and civil rights around the world had shaped his views. And I think people genuinely liked him. And I laughed at what Stephen said at the start about Hume Ken Reid, because the last time I met John Hume was about 15 or 16 years broadcasting awards, just before I left the Andersonstown News, and he was getting an award. And here he was rightly that night. He was in great form. He got up and he sang. He got pictures taken with everyone. And you could see that there was a man who liked a bit of crack as well. And I think that probably endeared him to those sort of world leaders. He wasn't this sort of stiff politician. He was a man that went in and go, right, okay, no, let's talk about this, but let's sit down, have a drink and talk about this. And there was all those qualities about him as well as a fierce intellect. And as Stephen said, a vision for how he thought that this place should be and should be run. And the key to that, and we say that even now, and I can't believe we're still saying it now, when we look at the problem with very young people getting sucked into paramilitary groups, it's always due to the economy. It's always due to their social and economic situation. It's people who are on the fringes of society that get brought into that world of violence, and he could see that. So he could say, if all these men have jobs, that will be their main, that will occupy them, and that will help us then create a space to try and get a settlement to the violence. And he could see that the economy and the inequality that existed around the economy was key to change in that place. And I think that that's still relevant today. That's not something that was just relevant in the 60s and 70s. That's entirely relevant until this day. But yeah, I think that, I like looking through the old archive pictures, but I think that some of those pictures, John Hume up against the wall, the soldier with a gun at him and all that, remember, that was how he managed to command the respect of the people of Derry who loved him, adored him. And this was a Republican community, remember, who then voted en masse, for the SDLP and trusted him even through those worst days of the Troubles, because he wasn't, this passive sort of wishy-washy character. He did command respect. He did know what it was that he wanted, and he was willing to go out and fight for it, albeit fight for it in a political arena. So I think that, there's so much to what makes a person a great leader, and I think that all of those qualities combined are very rare in a person. And that's why when we're looking back at it now, we're saying such an extraordinary life to have lived, because he did possess so many qualities. Some people might possess one or two of those, but very few possess all of them.
Yeah, and you're right in what you're saying. I mean, it's worth noting that Hume overthrew the existing nationalist leadership in 1969 at the age of, I think, 31, 32. He took on Eddie McAteer, the leader of Northern nationalism at the time, and beat him in his first election. So he wasn't shy about taking on his opponents. I mean, Stephen, Alison raises a good point there. I mean, Hume's leadership wasn't always smooth. I mean, he had a lot of criticism from sections of the media about talking with Sinn Féin and Gerry Adams. I mean, some of the criticism was pretty strident, against him. So how do you think? And it didn't seem to deter him. How do you think he kind of cut through all of that at a really critical time?
Well, he cut through it, but at great personal cost. I mean, I do remember him being very down at various points about all of this. I mean, I did have a wry smile to myself this morning when I saw the Irish Independent's front page. And independent newspapers ran a campaign against him that was just vitriolic beyond belief, particularly the Sunday Independent. And they just brutalized him every weekend. I think at one weekend there was something like 6 or 7 anti-Hume stories. Now that's obviously he can blow off the media, but there were elements of his own party who believed that he was being dragged around by Sinn Féin, and there were huge disputes and rows, and even the odd bit of fisticuffs at SDLP annual conferences about this sort of stuff. After midnight, well after midnight on dance floors, blows were exchanged. I know that for a fact because I was there. So, and at one point, it seemed to be that every single part, almost every single part of society here was moving against him in terms of unionists. Were absolutely outraged that he was talking to Adams. I don't think Republicans treated him particularly well at that stage as well. And then there were elements of his own party who weren't there. And to have the physical wherewithal and the stickability and the guts and the vision to stay with what he was doing, I just think tells you so much about the man.
Yeah. And Alison, as Stephen was talking about there, his relationship with Republicans was so key. So trying to straddle that moderate wing of the SDLP, who didn't want to talk to Sinn Féin, while also trying to bring them closer to him. What did you make of how he handled that?
I think it's interesting because what he sacrificed to achieve peace is his own, basically, political career. The SDLP, as we know, then went into a state of almost unstoppable decline as Sinn Féin gained ground and became the sort of party of choice for nationalists once we had the peace process. I don't know whether he could have seen that was going to come, or whether he had just decided, and rightly so, that saving lives was more important than getting votes. But interestingly, the sort of the reaction from that that section of the press, which was entirely predictable, let's face it, because that reaction was not an anti-SDLP, anti-Hume reaction. That reaction was an anti-Republican reaction, and that was typical of the sort of attitude of a lot of people within the NIO at that time. And that was when it came to funding for nationalist communities. We know from the papers that we're able to look back on now, in the state papers, that there was funding withheld, that people were described, I think in one of the state papers, they described people from my community as uncivilized. And so therefore, the attitude was that you should not be speaking to these people, that no one should be speaking to them. We will crush them, we will crush them, and we will crush them in this way, and we won't talk to them. And that's sort of still, I suppose, is the attitude of some people now. You don't like to say we should be speaking to people to try and bring them through, regardless of who they are. And I was interested to see some of the people involved in that sort of press campaign against Hume trying to double down on that this week. Personally, I'd have just left that. Do you know what I mean? I admit you were on the wrong side of history and let that go. To try and defend that with hindsight at this stage, I think is folly. It's completely and utterly foolish. We can see what was achieved, and we know that whether people thought he was right at the time, when we look back at this now, in the luxurious position that we now find ourselves in, we don't live the way that we did live 30 and 40 years ago. We can see that he was right, and we can see that what he was doing, regardless of how controversial it was at the time, was the right thing to do. But isn't that always the way? When you come to getting any great political settlement or peace agreement, or at the end of any sort of war or conflict, it takes someone to have the bravery to do something and go against the grain, and that was what he did. But what he also did was, he said, because he loved the people of Derry, and I think he was as angry as the demonisation of the people of Derry as anything else, as he said, this is how we'll take these people along and make their lives better, and we don't do it by demonising them, we don't do it by interning them, we don't do them by battering them, we'll do it this way. And at the end, he was right, and he was proved right. I think that all those who criticised him for at the time have to look back and say that with hindsight that was the right thing to do, regardless, and we know because the IRA were still involved in the campaign at the time, so he was talking to people at the time. But remember that those who criticised him, there were also back channels with the British government at the time. So those who were most vocal in criticising him at that time also were involved in talks with Sinn Féin and with Gerry Adams. For goodness sake, we know that Martin McGuinness, flew into Downing Street, in his 20s and had meetings in Whitehall in relation to peace. So the same people who were criticising him for doing that had their own back channels, although they were trying to keep those much quieter at the time.
And Stephen, we can't obviously have a discussion about John Hume without talking about the Good Friday Agreement. You were there, famously had to stand outside for numerous days, waiting for them to get an agreement. How critical was John Hume to getting that agreement across the line?
Well, I think I listened to Senator Mitchell talking about his importance, and that's enough for me because Mitchell is a big figure in all of this. And he said that Hume was pivotal. And there's no, the whole basis of the peace process is John Hume's template. It's the three relationships, within Northern Ireland, North-South, and then the East-West relationship involving London. So his understanding of that, and although a lot of heavy lifting was done by others as well, and particularly Seamus Mallon, and the way it was broken up into so many different fora, but there was an awful lot of reporting back to John Hume, and John Hume was using direct access with Senator Mitchell the whole way through this, and not all of those conversations were pleasant.
And Alison, what do you? I mean, obviously, when the Good Friday Agreement was signed, Hume obviously went on to was nominated and eventually got, along with David Trimble, the Nobel Peace Prize. So again, that international recognition for his work. What do you think of his role in bringing that agreement together?
I think that, and you were there as well, David. I think you were there too, Stephen. If we go back to 2 years ago, to the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement and all of those events that took place to commemorate that time, and the event in Queen's, and we could see those international figures flying in because they all wanted to be a part of that remembered, despite the fact, if you remember, the couple were in divorce therapy at the time, there was no assembly at the time anyway. But and Hume was missing from that, obviously, because of his illness, and that I think that there was two people missing from those events, and that was him and Mo Molan, and that was the two people who, that I think that they were so pivotal in that because of their attitude and because of their personality and because of their never take no for an answer type of personality that helped bring that across the line. And yet both of them weren't there at that time. Obviously, one had passed away and one due to his illness. And I think that as we go on and we look at the fact that, Martin McGuinness is now passed, Ian Paisley is now passed, I think that the stories that those people have to tell, we really do need, and it's, as a journalist and as a storyteller, to capture that time, because for some of the young people today who enjoy a lot of the freedoms and liberties that came with that peace process, they don't understand how it came to be like that. They take it for granted, and quite rightly so. I love that they do. But I think that for historical sake, we need to remember where we came from, where we are, and how we got there, and those people who were in the middle of that transition. And obviously, as Stephen said, this was John Hume's vision, from he was a very young man. This was his vision, and he pushed and pushed and pushed to see it through. And we know there are so many people who deserve recognition for doing that at that time and for putting their necks on the line, and for refusing to give up even when things looked like they were completely hopeless. And I'm sure there's times when Stephen and the rest of the journalists at that time were standing outside. It all seemed hopeless. There was more false starts than enough before we actually got across the line. But his role in it is rightly being remembered, and it's sad, but again, it's the way of things. It's only when someone dies that we get the new generation of people who are able to listen and read and see, oh, well, that was the person that helped this become so. And I hope that a lot of them will read a lot of the sort of tributes and the remembrance that's going on, and some of them don't read newspapers, but maybe they'll read it online.
And obviously, I mean, Stephen, looking back at some of the election results, I mean, in John Hume's last European election, he polled 190,000 first preference votes. He polled consistently well ahead of the SDLP in terms of their party support. So he obviously did have a personal vote. In terms of how he was got in the community, did you find that when you were covering him, the people saying, oh, I may not be sure about certain aspects of the SDLP, but I really like John Hume? Did you pick that up much?
He was the SDLP to a lot of people. His reach was enormous. I mean, I think there's a lot of post hoc rationalisation going on, as Alison has alluded to, among unionism. Unionism didn't like him because they feared him, because they knew that he was a smart man who knew what he was about, and he was relentless in what he was achieving. He also, don't underestimate the amount of heavy lifting that was done alongside John by Mark Durkan. I mean, unionism the whole way through the 1980s used to say, 80s and early 90s, our problem is we don't have a Durkan, because John had the great vision of what was happening and the nuts and bolts of that. Mark Durkan played a big role in all of that and was absolutely in lockstep with John along the way for that. So he was good about who he had around him as well. And that sense, in the public sense, the average person understood a man who absolutely hated any form of violence, and they respected him for that.
Okay, so time for some final thoughts. And Alison, as I go to you on this, I think it's just worth bringing into the conversation. John was part of a team. He was very well supported by his wife, Pat. What do you think, your final thoughts on John Hume and that incredible partnership that saw him through his political career?
I think it's lovely and it's endearing, and I really felt for this week because my own father has dementia, so I know what it's like to have someone who is so smart and so well read and so booky, and then see them just disappear. They physically remain, but the rest of them goes, and so I felt for her, and sometimes I think that I hope that she can remember the man she met, the man standing in the middle of Derry with a rubble, with his hand up to the place, that man, and that's the person she can look back and remember throughout her life, and not obviously when that awful disease stripped him, of who he was in his later years. But I do think that what we will remember is that generation of politicians, whether you agreed with them or disagreed with them, whether the unionists or nationalists, they were activists, and they believed entirely in what they were doing. Among that group of politicians, you'll not find one career politician who decided to go into politics because it was a good job and a pension. They were activists. They were there because they believed in something. Whether we believe in it now or not is irrelevant. And he believed in that the whole way through his political career and political life. And I think, as John says before we come on, he was Derry's father, and I think for that city, he will be remembered, and I'm sure that they'll spend this week remember him in their own special way. Derry's a beautiful place. We all love visiting it. When there's such a sense of him within the people of Derry.
Yeah, Stephen, your final thoughts on John Hume?
He always described himself not as some sort of, I think Alison alluded to this earlier, he described himself as an extremist. I'm an extremist for peace, he used to say. And there was a fabulous double act between him and his wife, Pat, an absolute lady. And they were just an amazing double act. And it was the old-fashioned things about him that I remember. And one of my prized possessions is after he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, Tyrconnell Whiskey in Derry produced 100 bottles to honour him, and he drove the whole way down to give me one of those, and it will never be opened. I thought last night, do you know what? I probably need to lift a glass to him, but I thought, no, that's family treasure. We're never getting rid of that. And it was just there were tremendous old-fashioned things about him. That little bit of attention to detail, the friendships that he made and he kept, and we all are so much the worse for his passing.
Okay. Guys, thank you so much for your thoughts. Allison Morris, Stephen Grimason, John Boyle, John Hume, may rest in peace. Thank you so much for tuning in to this edition of Slugger TV. We'll be back next month. Thank you for watching.